Hello, this is our review for the Unit 3.5 test. I'm just going to quickly verbally go through each of the terms on the study guide. All right, the Little Albert experiment, you need to know the background details. Remember that Little Albert was a little boy that John Watson borrowed from an orphanage. In that experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was a loud banging sound on some metal that they hit behind Little Albert's head. The unconditioned response to that was fear and crying. The neutral stimulus was the white rat that he seemed to fine with. The conditioned stimulus became the white rat as they paired the loud sound and the white rat together. And then Albert's conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus of the white rat was fear. And they did generalize that to all furry objects. Positive and negative reinforcement tie into operant conditioning, which was B.F. Skinner. Both of those increase a behavior to happen more often. With positive reinforcement, we increase the behavior by adding something, like cheerleaders praising the basketball team, and that helps them score more points. Negative reinforcement, we help increase the points by taking something away. So we might take out a corrupt referee who's making bad calls. So by removing the bad referee, the team is able to score more points. Stimulus generalization and discrimination can apply to both classical and operant conditioning, though we think of it more with classical conditioning. Generalization happens when other stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus are presented. So, for example, in Little Albert's study, there were other furry objects that were also brought out, then hit, and at the same time that they made the loud sound. So, Little Albert learned to fear all furry objects. The discrimination would happen if they had brought out those other furry objects, but not ever made the loud sound. Then he would have learned to fear only the specific white rat. There will be lots of questions where there's a little scenario and it asks you what the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response are, and so on. Remember that the UCS and the UCR, the UCS is always going to be something that creates a natural reflexive response. So, for example, meat powder causes salivation naturally. So meat powder is a UCS and the natural response is the UCR. A neutral stimulus is just what it sounds like. It has no response before training. Normally in an experiment, our neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and then our unconditioned response usually becomes our conditioned response, but to the neutral stimulus. Classical conditioning versus operant conditioning, both are methods of learning and teaching new behaviors. Classical conditioning involves forming an association between a neutral and a reflexive thing. Operant conditioning involves consequences. You do something and you receive either a good or a bad consequence, and that causes you to continue or stop the behavior. The fixed ratio schedules, all of those are partial schedules of reinforcement, part of operant conditioning. The ratio schedules have to do with how many responses are needed in order to gain the reward or a punishment. So, for example, if you have 4 tardies, we'll say 4 tardies, you could lose your exemption in the fall. That would be a fixed ratio schedule. If you have a teacher and you never know how often they're going to count their tardies, that would be a variable ratio schedule, that sometimes they count your tardy and sometimes they don't. Fixed interval and variable interval has to do with time. So a fixed interval would be if your teacher gives you a quiz every Friday. That's a fixed interval schedule. A variable interval is if your teacher gives pop quizzes and you don't know when the quizzes will come. In general, remember those partial schedules last longer than a continuous schedule because you never know when the punishment or reinforcement will happen. Reinforcement versus punishment. Again, this goes with operant conditioning. Reinforcement always increases a behavior. Punishment always decreases a behavior. Positive and negative punishment are both going to decrease a behavior. The positive and negative refers to adding or taking something away. So, for example, if somebody is speeding and a police officer gives them a ticket and they have to pay a very large fine, that would be positive punishment because they have to pay money. They're having to add something. Wait, that's a bad example. I think we talked about not doing that one because they're actually losing money. Let's say if they have to do can't think of a good example right now. I'll take away the speeding example. But let's say if the parents get mad at them for speeding and they give them extra chores to do, that extra work could be a positive punishment. If the parents take away their car keys, we could consider that a negative punishment because they're taking something away. Spontaneous recovery, this can apply again to both classical and operant conditioning, but this is when a learned behavior has gone extinct and then it randomly comes back. That is a spontaneous recovery. Higher order conditioning, we really only talked about a little bit, but higher order conditioning involves classical conditioning where a conditioned stimulus can now act as an unconditioned stimulus. So the example I think we used in class said if you, a hamburger creates salivation for you, but seeing a McDonald's is neutral. But then after you have paired those together for so long, then the restaurant becomes an unconditioned stimulus for you. And then the arches can now become a conditioned stimulus. So it's taking it a step further to where something that was learned now can act as an unconditioned stimulus. Extinction is when a behavior goes away because an unconditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the response. So eventually the behavior fades away. Primary versus secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are anything that provide for a biological need like food, water, and shelter. A secondary reinforcer are things that we like, but we don't necessarily need for survival. So praise, good grades, money, those are the best examples. Candy could fall under primary reinforcer because that's a food. Shaping is part of operant conditioning. We practiced this in class when we did the clapping demo where we tried to teach our classmates a little behavior by clapping for them as they got closer and closer. But with shaping, we teach a behavior by rewarding every close approximation to the behavior. 14, if we link multiple shaped behaviors together, we call that chaining. So like teaching a dog to roll over would be shaping. Teaching him to roll over and run through a tunnel and then sit and then go fetch a newspaper, that would be chaining. In the Pavlov salivating dog experiment, you want to know the details. The unconditioned stimulus was the meat powder. The unconditioned response was salivation to meat powder. The neutral stimulus was the tuning fork. Pavlov paired the meat powder with a tuning fork. So eventually the tuning fork becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response becomes salivation to the tuning fork alone. The Bandura Bobo doll experiment, this was Albert Bandura. Remember that young children, I think they were 4 years old, observed an adult playing aggressively with a Bobo doll. And then when they had the opportunity to play with toys, they did the same thing, even though there was no reward or punishment involved. So this experiment demonstrated that aggression can be an observed and learned behavior, even when there's no reward or punishment involved. And that became kind of the first era of studies about aggression through observation. Effects of punishment in general, they can cause negative results, that they cause avoidance behaviors, they can increase aggression, and they don't necessarily actually solve the problems. Social learning theory, this was part of Albert Bandura's theory, and we also called it observation, but the idea that learning can happen without any rewards or punishments or associations simply by watching somebody do something. So watching somebody how to tie shoes or how to put makeup on. Social learning theory says you can do those things just by watching. Each of these are on here. Before you would have had to know the names. Now you don't really have to know the names, but you need to make sure that you recognize each of these types of learning. Remember that classical conditioning you can always identify by the UCS, UCR. Key thing there is it involves a reflexive, involuntary response. The law of effect, this is kind of the precursor for operant conditioning. Law of effect is the one that says if you like the results of something, you will continue to do the behavior, which is basically what operant conditioning is. Operant conditioning involves positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishments. So rewards and punishments can increase or decrease behavior. And then schedules of reinforcement can affect how quickly those happen. Watson, we know that John Watson is considered the founder of behaviorism, and behaviorism altogether is about studying only observable behaviors, not what we're thinking, but what we're actually doing. Watson was famous for the classical conditioning experiment of Little Albert. So Little Albert was a classical conditioning experiment because it had the unconditioned stimulus of the loud noise and the rat, and then he conditioned him to fear all furry objects just from that loud sound. And then finally, again, Bandura was the Bobo doll experiment, which was the example for observational learning and social learning, the idea that learning can happen just through watching. All right, that's it. Good luck on your test.